There is a place up in Vermont known as Green Mountain National Forest. It takes up around 50% of Bennington County, surrounding the Glastonbury Mountains at its center. Between the years of 1943 and 1950, several mysterious disappearances took place in its deep, dark forests. The disappearances became so prolific that the area took on a new name among frightened locals, the Bennington Triangle, due to some similarities with disappearances around the Caribbean island of Bermuda. Since that time, the disappearances became an entrenched part of local folklore, and to this day, the area's occupants warn against wandering alone in the Green Mountain National Forest. Before the 18th century, the Glastonbury area was mostly uninhabited by European settlers. The governor of New Hampshire chartered the town in 1761, and by 1791, just 6 families called the tiny community home. Yet today, merely 8 residents remain within the ruins of Glastonbury's ghost town. It enjoyed something of a boom in about 1870 when it became a logging town, and as many as 300 timber workers moved into Glastonbury to harvest the surrounding forests. But overlogging of the mountain decimated the trees and eventually led to the town's economic decline. Perhaps the logging damage to the habitats of the local wildlife led to the Native Americans believing that the new industry had disturbed and angered the spirits of the forest. Or maybe the Glastonbury curse was something entirely more menacing. However, it is tough to discern just how much of what people say about the Bennington Triangle is actually true. Details surrounding the various vanishings have varied over the years, even down to the particulars of those that actually went missing. But what is clear is that for eons before European settlers ever occupied the area, the local Native American people used the area as a burial ground for their dead, believing that the spirits of their ancestors inhabited the forests and would curse anyone who strayed too far into the dark and isolated woods. They stayed well away from the area, but the same could not be said for those that traveled from across the Atlantic. One particularly eerie piece of folklore from the Abenaki tribe tells of a rock that ate the souls of all that passed near, which to them explained why the woods were so devoid of the typical sounds of nature, such as bird songs or the buzzing of insects, and why many attested to such frightening sensations while hunting near the woods. However, there may well be some actual science behind such claims, as geologists say the area has an unusually large amount of sinkholes due to subterranean water erosion. But regardless, the list of those declared missing after venturing into the forest is long indeed, and these are just a few of them. In 1943, a man named Carl Herrick and his cousin Henry were taking part in a hunting trip just 10 miles northeast of Glastonbury town. The story goes that at one point during the trip, Carl walked off into the woods to relieve himself. Yet after some time, Carl still hadn't returned to the spot that they were resting at, so Henry called out through the woods to him, only to receive no reply. For hours and hours, his cousin searched for him, but Carl was nowhere to be found. Over the following days, a search party scoured the woods for any sign of Carl Herrick, and eventually, a body was found that was believed to be his. But his remains showed bizarre signs of having been crushed by some ungodly force, so badly that Carl's ribs had punctured his lung. But there were no signs of anything that could have possibly inflicted such wounds. Henry is reported to have said that the search party found that there were large bear prints around the corpse, but a bear would not have squeezed a man like that, nor would it have left fresh meat to spoil like that, being the occasional scavenger animals that they are. Something must have severely spooked that bear if it left a corpse alone like that. Just 2 years later, in 1945, the Mitty Rivers incident occurred. Mitty was a very experienced and hardy outdoorsman, and very few people knew the forest around Green Mountain better than he did. One day, Mitty was heading up a hunting party in a place known as Hell's Hollow when he happened to stray a little too far ahead. Soon, it dawned on his fellow hunters that Mitty was no longer with them. But none of the hunters showed any initial concern. After all, Mitty was probably the most skilled hunter and tracker that any of them had ever known. It had to just be a matter of time before he found them again. Yet no one ever saw or heard from him ever again. After a long and intensive search of the surrounding woods, the only trace of Midi Rivers was an empty rifle cartridge that matched up with the kind that he was known to use. There was no blood or shredded clothing left behind, no evidence of an animal attack whatsoever, and his corpse was never found. But perhaps the most well-known of all the Bennington Triangle disappearances is the case of Paula Weldon. She was a sophomore student at the nearby Bennington University, and on the 1st of December, 1946, 18-year-old Paula headed out into the woods on a short hike intended to relieve the stress of her studies. Paula was wearing a light red jacket, not ideal for a lengthy hike in cold weather, so it is safe to say that she had not intended to be out for a particularly long time. She was last sighted by a couple out for a walk on a stretch of land known as Long Trail. They witnessed Paula turn a corner, but when they reached the same spot, she had inexplicably vanished from sight, and it would be hard to miss such a bright red jacket among the dark foliage. The following day, when her classmates noticed her unusual absence, they informed the local police, who commenced a thorough search of the Long Trail. The search party was 1,000 strong at times, even included a number of light aircraft enlisted by the FBI. But still, not a trace of Paula was ever found. Paula was by far the most famous case, but the most tragic was that of 8-year-old Paul Jefferson. Paul's mother was employed by the local garbage dump, and on the 12th of October, 1950, Paul accompanied his mother to work since he was off school for the holiday. They didn't intend to stay long at all, so Paul's mother told him to stay put in the truck while she popped into the dump's office to complete a few pieces of paperwork. But when she got back to the truck, Paul was gone. Much like Paula Weldon, Paul was wearing a brightly colored rain jacket that would be almost impossible to miss on the backdrop of the surrounding woods. But when another huge search was mounted, which this time included sniffer dogs from the local police force, nothing was found. It was as if Paul had vanished into thin air. But analysis of local Abenaki folklore found a disturbing tidbit of information regarding the wearing of bright colors in the forest. Apparently, it is extremely bad luck to wear anything but dark shades while visiting Native American burial grounds, as it offends the spirits of the dead. A truly terrifying detail to consider. In the same month, October of 1950, a young woman named Frida Langer and her family were on a camping trip near the Somerset Reservoir, deep within the Bennington Triangle. Frida and her cousin Herbert set off on a hike around the area. But less than a mile into their little adventure, Frida took a tumble and landed in a stream. But given that they weren't all that far from their campsite, Frida turned back to get a change of clothes, while Herbert waited at the site of her accident for her return. After an hour or so of waiting, Herbert walked back to the camp, outraged that his cousin would leave him waiting so long. But when he asked after her, he discovered she'd never made it back to camp. Her disappearance was completely unexplainable, and many puzzled over how a girl could possibly vanish over the course of such a short journey. And by this time, the number of inexplicable vanishings meant that the woods had garnered quite the reputation as being mysteriously but undeniably dangerous. It also seemed like the power of the Bennington Triangle is not just confined to the woods. James Tedford, a veteran of World War II, was returning to his residence at a VA hospital in Bennington in 1949 after a visit to some of his family in nearby St. Albans. His journey was via a Greyhound bus that held no more than 14 other passengers. But somehow, when the bus arrived in Bennington, Tedford wasn't on board. Yet, strangely, not only was his luggage still in the bus rack, but personal items belonging to Tedford, including a jacket and his ticket, were sitting in his seat in his place. The other passengers were later questioned by police when he was reported missing. Not a single one reported seeing him disembark at any point on the journey. In fact, they had seen him sitting in his seat at every single scheduled stop, just not the one he was due to get off at, Bennington. Since Tedford's disappearance was yet another in a series of mysterious vanishings in the Bennington area, police were eager to get to the bottom of the case as quickly as possible. But logically speaking, they could only settle on one solid conclusion: that Tedford had never boarded the bus in the first place. But this stood in stark contrast to the fact that not only was his luggage on board, but he had been sighted by many of his fellow passengers. Like many of the other disappearances in the Bennington Triangle, Tedford's case remains totally unsolved to this day. But there must be practical, tangible explanations for such vanishings, even if they seem fairly outlandish. One theory centers around the intense, unpredictable weather patterns that the New England area suffers from. Professional hikers and mountaineers alike insist that the disappearances are down to nothing more than poor weather, since wind patterns in the area can be incredibly erratic. Even those familiar with the area could lose their footing in perilous situations or suffer from serious disorientation in some cases. However, although this might account for one or two of the missing persons, it certainly does not account for all of them. Many visitors to the area have also reported seeing cougars in the Green Mountain National Forest. These big cats can stalk hunters for long distances while waiting for an opportune moment to strike. Lone hikers are by far the most at risk, especially during the winter when the mountain lion's natural prey is scarce, which also happens to be when the majority of disappearances have occurred. Because they can weigh more than 200 pounds, a powerful cougar can subdue and kill someone very quickly. But a mountain lion would most certainly leave behind traces of their kills, be it bones or shredded clothing, and in most of the Bennington disappearances, not a single piece of evidence of the unfortunate souls has been found. However, another theory, one rooted in mental illness, is much more feasible. One story tells of a bizarre character by the name of McDowell moving to Bennington in 1892, looking for work at a local sawmill. The man was a solitary, quiet soul brimming with malevolent intent, and was viewed with suspicion and fear by the other workers. Then, after a few months of floating from job to job, he got into an argument with a foreman and smashed the man over the head with a hammer before slaying another that came to the foreman's defense. The man was ranting and raving as local lawmen cornered him in one of the town's taverns, and once he was in custody, he was confined to an insane asylum for the foreseeable future. But the man was wild, violent, and cunning, and it didn't take long for him to escape the asylum and flee into the mountains to hide among their many caves and caverns. Some say the horrendous environment of the asylum, the callous abuse of the orderlies and doctors, had turned him well and truly feral. And every so often, the man would descend from the mountains to terrorize the residents of the town, wearing only a long black coat with a pistol in his hand. McDowell may have been able to prey upon the town's residents during the early 1900s, but by the middle of the century, he would have been a much older man and may not have even survived the wilderness for such a considerable length of time. Perhaps it'll never be entirely certain what is to blame for the bizarre disappearances in the Bennington Triangle, but be it the weather, wild animals, or a deranged serial killer, the area is without a doubt one of the most inexplicably dangerous places in the entirety of the United States. For those who were unlucky enough to find themselves alone among the trees there, it is truly chilling to think that these disappearances might never be solved, that the fates of those poor souls might be forever kept a secret, hidden among the dark trees of the Green Mountain National Forest.